Hi, everybody. I am at New Realm's newest brewery in Greenville, South Carolina, and I'm going to talk to Mitch Steele, the one and only Mitch Steele. But hey, before we jump into this, please do me a big favor and share a comment or two, maybe about West Coast IPAs, your Mitch Steele stories, or even some New Realm stories, because I know they have several locations and a lot of you are big fans. So, Mitch, first of all, what do we have here?
Well, this is a new West Coast IPA for us. This is one that we came out with in December of 2023. So it's been around for a few months now. It's doing really well for us. It's called Kick Flipper IPA, and we identified it as a West Coast IPA. The hops in it are Centennial, Simcoe, and Citra. And so it's a nice hop combination. We did something kind of interesting with this one. We didn't use any specialty malts at all, just base malt,
Okay.
two-row malt, and Pilsner
We're
malt.
going to talk about that more later.
I know we are. So, yeah, I wanted to bring that up with this beer in particular. So, yeah, that's
Can we go ahead and open it?
absolutely.
All right. See what we got here. Ooh, smells wonderful. Piney and siffy. Look at that pour. It's beautiful.
Not bad, huh?
No. Awesome. Put this up here. Well, cheers. Cheers, Doc. Oh, wow. I love that.
Yeah,
That is so refreshing.
yeah, we're real happy with it, and it's doing well for us. So it's exciting.
Drink the heck out of that. What's the ABV?
6.5%. Actually, 7%. I take that back. And yeah.
Okay,
So be careful.
I have to
right?
pace
Yeah.
myself on that. Well, let me tell you, for those of you that have never met Mitch, he's quite a guy. We've judged together in some places, but more importantly, he has written the book on IPA brewing techniques. Mitch, can you hand me that? Let me, of course, show that to everybody. Awesome book. Highly recommended if you want to learn all you can about IPAs. Uh, and this highlights Mitch's deep knowledge and passion for craft beer. He's also the founder and brewer at New Belgium Brewery. They have several locations. Is it 5-ish?
Yeah, New Realm, we have five locations.
Yeah.
We started in Atlanta. We have a big production brewery in Virginia Beach, a brew pub outside of Charleston on Daniel Island. We've opened up a small brewery and tap room on the campus of Auburn University and Greenville now.
So, well, and I'm glad you're in Greenville. So this is a first for me. The first interview I have done actually in Greenville. This is fabulous. Well, thank you for that. And thank you for all you've done for those of us that love delicious beers like this. So crafting high quality West Coast IPAs requires some pretty serious brewing skills. And I know you have those and you proved it over all the years, but as you reflect on your brewing journey, what initially drew you to the IPA style and how has some early experiences shaped your approach to brewing it?
Yeah, well, I got into brewing in the early 1980s at UC Davis, and I was living in the Bay Area. And I I don't remember exactly what the first IPA was that I ever drank, but I remember it was at a beer festival in the late 1980s. I had just gotten into professional brewing. I was working at a little brew pub in Hollister, California, and we were doing English style beers, and we were doing session beers. And the owner, Bill Millar, wanted to do session beers. He wanted people to come in and hang out like a British pub, and which was wonderful. But I remember going to beer festivals at that time, and just at the very start of my career, and tasting beers like Anchor Liberty Ale.
Oh, wow.
And there were
Very fresh Liberty Ale.
yeah,
Yes.
yeah, right in the Bay Area, right in the heart of Anchor Country. A beer like Rubicon IPA out of Sacramento, and tasting those beers, going, "Oh my gosh, this is the hop expression here is unlike anything I've ever had." And, and then you talk to the brewers and you talk about we talk about the story of the IPA as it was known back then. And the whole history of, the English brewing a stronger beer and dry hopping in the cask and shipping it, and it survived the trip to India. And that whole story was brand new at the time. Right. And it was really exciting to hear and learn. And back then, brewers,
whether you liked history or not.
yeah, I mean, but in when craft beer was just starting, it was like you wanted to learn the history of these styles that you never got to taste in the United States before. And so that was part of it.
Well, those early experiences must have meant a lot to you, because you certainly have gone on to really write the book on the style, literally. But these hops, you mentioned hops, and that was one of the things that attracted you. Can you share kind of a moment in your brewing career where hops just became one of the a deeper significance for you, and you kind of had this realization that I've got to understand hops and how to put them in beer?
Yeah, I think, when I was studying brewing science at UC Davis, that was the first time I ever actually held a hop in my hand. And we had a little pilot brewery on campus, and we were using whole hops. And so they were dried flowers, and I remember smelling them. And, that was one of those moments where I realized that what I was smelling was the same aromatic. And this will take you back, the same aromatic that I was getting out of Henry Weinhard's beer. And Henry Weinhard's Private Reserve, I always, when I was a young beer drinker and I had that beer, I always thought it had this very different aroma than the other beers I was drinking at that time. And I could never figure it out. And I connected it,
Wow.
And then it's like, okay, now I'm getting what hops are all about. And then later on, as I started home brewing and started getting into the craft beer scene in the Bay Area, then I started realizing, a beer like Liberty Ale or Sierra Nevada Ale, the importance of the hops. I mean, when I first tasted Sierra Nevada Pale Ale, I was like, oh my gosh. And that was when I was a senior in college. I was like, this is the hoppiest beer I've ever had in my life. This is unbelievable, and it was jarring, right?
Yep.
But I mean, it's gotten to the point where that's, kind of what I look for in a beer, is that kind of hop experience.
Denny Kahn said it ought to slap you in the face. The bitterness. Did you say
Love it.
that?
Sometimes, yeah, it depends on the beer, but I like that.
Drew Beecham said it has morphed to more of a tap.
Yeah. Maybe. I don't know if that's our palates changing or whether the beer has morphed as well, but it's still got a nice hop character to it.
Well, Stan Hieronymus is fascinating to me. When we talk about hops, he talks about the importance of blending them.
Yeah.
That you don't want the one note. So was there a particular challenge that you've had in trying to balance the bitterness of the hops versus the aromatics? And was there a moment when it was like a turning point when you feel like you've got it? It's starting to work. Maybe important. This is repeatable.
Yeah, that's a really tough question, because I've brewed in so many different regions in the United States, and every region has different flavor profiles that are preferred. I'll tell you, when I got to Stone Brewing Company in 2006 and started managing the brewing of beers like Stone IPA and Arrogant Bastard, I was surprised at how much they focused on single hops and in their dry hopping process. And not that their beers were all single hop, most of them weren't, but most of them focused on one hop variety and then had little bits and pieces of others. And that got us into trouble very early on when there was a hop shortage in 2007.
Oh, wow.
And Stone relied very heavily on Centennial hops, and Centennial hops were one of the hops that was short because of the fire in Yakima or where the story was. And we had to find a way to make that beer without having our full supply of Centennial hops. So that was a real challenge. And I will say that when I was at Anheuser-Busch, and I was at Anheuser-Busch for 14 years, one of the things I took from Anheuser-Busch was blended 7 to 8 varieties of hops in most of their beers. And the reason they did that was so that year to year changes in the crop would not be readily apparent. The blend could be adjusted to compensate for that. And it was a very intricate process and very involved. But as my time at Stone went on, more and more of the beers that we brewed there were focused less on one particular hop and more on a blend of hops. And I think that it helps you weather the storms, and
There are practical reasons, but are there a taste point of view? Because Stan Hieronymus said if you're not careful, there's a loss of complexity with just a few hop varieties.
yeah, and I think there's truth to that. It depends on what you're trying to brew. I mean, if you have a beer that's 100% Citra hops, that's a wonderful beer.
Yeah.
Achieving consistency with that beer is going to be tough. But
Okay.
it just depends. I personally like to blend hops. I think it adds more to the flavor complexity of the beer, but also brew a lot of single hop beers just to evaluate the hop and understand how it plays in the beer, and so I think there's value to both.
So for short runs, it might be really good. For
Yeah.
long runs, not so much so.
Yeah, because the beer's going to change,
Yeah.
as it goes. So I think that's important.
Well, brewers often struggle with hop bitterness. And as you mentioned, meeting those palates, and Drew Beecham said it's a tap on the face.
Yeah.
Denny said it's a slap. So what are the obstacles that you've kind of run into with IBUs, hop varieties, and how has malt factored into that in your experiences?
I think it's a combination of a lot of things. I think number one, the malt can get in the way of the bitterness, or if you're using certain types of like specialty malts, you can accentuate the bitterness to a level that you may not want.
Really?
Yeah, because darker roasting malts tend to add some bitterness character to the beer. So you may be targeting a certain amount of bitterness from the hops, and then your malt bill may change the perception.
So something like Bigfoot, that might be extra challenging with.
Yeah,
I never thought of that.
so I think it's just, and it's one of those things that you've got to understand what the malt's going to contribute as well as the hops. When you're building your recipe and dialing in your bitterness targets. The other thing that related to that is regional differences, right? I moved to San Diego in 2006, and if your IPA wasn't 60, 70, 80 IBUs, you were doing it wrong. 2000
punch in the face.
Yeah, that is a punch in the face, and by design, and that was a lot of fun. Moved to Atlanta and we came out with a beer that had 75 IBUs at the start, and it didn't go over as well, and so you've got to pay attention to what your customer.
Does 75 still go over on the West Coast?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
I think so. I haven't gone back and done a beer trip to the West Coast for a long time, but I still think that's kind of the going rate. I do know that in general, bitterness levels in IPAs are dropping.
Yeah.
I've seen that over the past 4 years or so, that just kind of across the board, IBU levels are dropping, and younger drinkers are, bitterness is an acquired taste. You gotta get used to it. And
But do you think that's why there's a modern IPA? That's what Denny referred to it as, a modern IPA.
Yeah.
The West Coast is an evolution essentially of the style.
Yeah, tastes change with generations changing and things like that. And we've had to make some adaptations. I mean, this kick flipper beer, it comes in at about 60 IBUs. And if I was doing this beer in
60.
no, it doesn't.
How do you hide that?
Um,
I taste it again.
So there's a couple things you can do as a brewer. Number one, your choice of hops, because certain hops lend a more robust or coarse bitterness, and other hops add a more gentle bitterness. And even though analytically they measure the same, they come across differently and sensorily. I think minimizing the boil time of hops helps reduce the perception of bitterness or the lingering aspect of bitterness. So like whirlpool hopping, that's such a bigger thing now than it was. And and you get a different kind of bitterness and different quality of bitterness from whirlpool hops than you do from a hop that's been boiled 60 or 90 minutes.
So you got to balance all that out.
Yeah, you just got to.
So a moment where you really felt like you kind of had your arms around it, so you could reliably produce beer over and over again.
Yeah, I think that happened at Stone. Where we got to the point where, like, if we were going to do a new IPA recipe, we knew how we wanted to approach it. And then I had to shift and I had to pivot when we started New Realm, and people wanted different levels of bitterness and different hop expressions than what I had done at Stone. So
Was that an easy transition?
no, it was hard.
What made it hard? That's interesting.
Well, I think the biggest thing that made it hard for me was the fact that I still wanted that West Coast IPA. Damn it, I wanted 75 IBUs. I wanted a punch in the face bitterness, and it just wasn't going to sell. And I just had to kind of come to my senses and figure out how to deal with it.
You weren't going to change them; they were going to change you.
Well, yeah, I mean that's yeah. You have to understand it's a battle you can win or not, and I didn't look at this as a battle, but it was a challenge, and it was kind of hard to make that adjustment. And I think having an IPA that maybe has a good bitterness, but it's balanced is so important these days. So versus the IBU arms race that we were having in the early 2000s, where the more bitter and the more punch you in the face, the better. That's not the case anymore.
But you were talking about 70 IBUs on the West Coast.
Mm-hmm.
You're saying this is 60.
Mm-hmm.
That is not what I remember a West Coast 70 IBU beer tasting like. This is a gentle, almost like prepares your palate for the next sip.
Yeah.
It is bitter, but it is not. It's like Denny said. It's not that slap. It's more like Drew said, and said it's kind of that.
Yeah.
So, how do you get that? How does that?
I think so. Really, with this particular beer, what we did is we minimized the kettle hopping. We did the kettle hopping kind of late, just to get some of the bitterness, and then we relied on the whirlpool hop to get most of the bitterness.
Okay,
and I think that really is a technique that I actually learned that from Steve Wagner at Stone. He was a big fan of whirlpool hopping, and the whirlpool hopping they did at Stone was unlike anything I'd ever seen. But at Stone, the difference was we also did a huge 60-minute hop edition as well. So we just really cranked up the bitterness. And at New Realm, I've been able to taper that edition back and just get most of the bitterness from that whirlpool hop. And I think it's a softer bitterness.
That's not a cheap process either, is it?
No, it's expensive.
Yeah,
it's expensive, especially with prices the way they've gone the last few years.
Yeah.
Well,
so consistency, we talked about that.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you mentioned the fires. Can you share an instance, maybe when doubt crept into you that you just felt like, oh my gosh, I don't think I can brew this beer consistently. And did you eventually do it? And what was it that sort of was your epiphany?
So there are a couple stories come to mind with that one. I think number one, the one time, if you talk self-doubt, that's in every brewer's mind all the time, right? You're just wondering whether it's going to work. And, being able to take risks is a wonderful luxury in this business, because if it doesn't work, you can regroup and do it again. And if you have a company that supports that process, it's absolutely marvelous. I think, one of the riskiest things I did was doing the black IPA at Stone, Sublimely Self-Righteous Ale, because Greg Cook was not interested in us doing that beer. I'd done a couple of pilot batches and they weren't turning out good. And I was like, oh my gosh, I went out on a limb on this thing. I talked.
What was not good?
So it was,
they were black at us?
No, they were plenty black. They weren't the hops weren't being showcased enough. They tasted like a hoppy stout or a hoppy porter. And I just wasn't getting what I was envisioning.
Yeah.
I had this vision of what I wanted this beer. It was too much roast. Yeah. And so what happened was I was, just reading either brewing articles or brewing books. And I was reading on Schwartz beer, German Schwartz beer. And I I learned about dehusk black malt.
Sure.
And that was like, okay, that's what we need to use in this beer. And so that's what we ended up using in it. And I remember being so excited when we tasted the final batch because it was what I had envisioned. And
The husks were contributing roastness?
yeah, yeah,
Really?
the astringency from the husks, and
Okay.
yeah, they contribute a lot. So the roast character that comes from a dehusked black malt is much softer and much lighter, but you still get a lot of color. And so my goal in making a black IPA was to make a beer that tasted like an IPA, but it was black, and the roast was integrated into the flavor, not the dominant flavor.
So this goes back to what you said earlier, that the darker malts
Yeah,
with the hoppiness can be really tricky.
they can clash. Yeah.
Wow.
So that's yeah. And then I think just in general terms, as far as consistency of the style, I think one of the big things that's overlooked by a lot of people or not well understood is just managing your fermentation and managing the yeast performance, making sure you don't get too much yeast growth, making sure that your yeast is not soaking up all your hop flavor, that you're adding you've got a consistent cell count of yeast in your beer when you're doing your dry hop, because the more yeast you have in your beer, the more of that flavor the yeast are going to absorb. So that can lead to inconsistencies with the dry hop flavor.
Is there a particular yeast you like with the West Coast?
Oh, I like California ale yeast.
Okay.
It's a very clean yeast. It doesn't add a lot of ester character. It's very neutral. It allows the hops to shine. There are other hops, English ale hops that work great for IPAs. It depends on the style, but that's Stone had a house yeast that they used
Sure.
that was fairly estery. And when I came to New Realm and we started brewing, I made a very conscious switch to Cal ale yeast.
Yeah, this is not estery at all. It just really
No, really, the
beautiful
hops really shine through, and
Yeah.
that's what I was shooting for.
Yeah, they are awesome. Well, we're talking about malt. Let's carry that a little further. So balancing malt sweetness with hop bitterness, that's a real challenge. Uh, hey, what's been your biggest obstacle to finding that nice balance? Because I'm guessing that's sort of the difference between that slap in the face versus the tap on the face when you have 60, 70 IBUs.
Yeah, I think you can go too far on the dry scale and too far on the sweet scale, and I always try to brew my IPA so they finish in between 2 and 3 degrees Plato as a terminal gravity. That just seems to be the sweet spot. I tend to prefer drier beers. Yeah. Yeah. Sorry about the pun. Yeah. I like beers drier. I think
Would you prefer that drier?
no, this is fine.
Okay,
And this beer finishes right around 3.
right around three.
So it's not very sweet.
So how would the bitterness change if it was drier? Because that's what we're really talking about.
It would be a little bit more accentuated,
Yeah.
a little more prominent in the finish, because obviously the sweetness manifests itself at the start of the palate, but also in the back of the palate as well. So when you're finishing the beer and swallowing the beer, the sweetness can linger and kind of clash with the hops if it's too sweet.
So it's almost like you're missing a little complexity when you let it go
Yeah.
too dry.
Yeah, you could. And I like having a little bit of sweetness for balance, but I also like it to be more on the dry side because that combined with a bitterness is what makes me want to take another drink of the beer.
So are there hops you use for that? Hops, excuse me. Are there malts that you prefer to get that sweetness? Or are there other malts that maybe you absolutely don't use because they contribute, either lack of sweetness or other negative characteristic?
Yeah, I tend to use a very large proportion of just American two row. If I want a little more malt complexity, using an English malt is nice. Adds a little character to the beer. I think, I don't use dark crystals in IPAs. I'll use light crystals in IPAs,
But I bet you used to.
I used to use like 40 and 60, and I did, and to correct myself. We came out with a beer at the end of 2023 that used 60 crystal in it. but it was a red IPA, and it was absolutely marvelous. But and we had this
celebration.
Yeah, it was definitely,
What's the downside of that?
the downside of that is if you don't hit the proper balance as the beer ages, the crystal malt character changes into more dried fruit and really accelerates the hop flavor drop off as the beer ages.
So that's why celebration just doesn't really last.
Yeah, it's why most people like to drink it really fresh,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
And it does hold up pretty well. I mean, Sierra Nevada is so dialed in.
Sure.
If I took a celebration that I bought in November and tried it now, it would still be wonderful. But
But it's not the same
it's
as it
not the
was
same.
in November.
You lose the hop character. And
Yeah.
just to give a shout out to Sierra Nevada, I don't buy a lot of beer for at home because I've got so much beer around me all the time. The one beer I make a point of buying every single year is Celebration Ale. It's one of my absolute favorite beers.
I'm on that page, and the more I learn about it, the more I realize what a just brewing brilliance that it is. I mean, it is kind of the ultimate beer.
Yeah.
Well, this has been awesome. We've got the rapid fire questions coming up,
Okay.
but you have an awesome book, and I want to make sure people know how to get a copy of it. How can people get a copy of it?
So this book came out through Brewers Publications, and you can still order it through Brewers Publications. It's also on Amazon, and I know More Beer sometimes carries it, and some homebrew shops carry it. We also try to carry it in our tap rooms, and so we usually have 2 or 3 copies of the book in our tap rooms, and then I will sign them for the ones that are on sale in the tap rooms. So,
Well, cool.
yeah. So it's still selling a bit. It's 12 years old now. So it's
So that makes it a classic.
it's a classic now. Yeah, people have been telling me I need to write another version. Which I don't know if I have that in me anymore, but that'd be an interesting project for.
Well, I wish you would. I wish you would. Well, these are awesome, and that's a great book. And I want to refill my glass with this delicious.
Okay.
And let's move on to the rapid fire questions. Are you ready?
Yeah, I'm ready.
Okay. For those of you that have to go, I understand that you might want to hang around for these rapid fire questions and put your comments in below and kind of what you thought about what Mitch said and what you think about West Coast IPAs. All right. So the rapid fire question, the first one we've got is, and these questions come from you. What mistakes are brewers making most often with West Coast IPAs?
That great question. I think number one, using too many hops and getting hop burn and getting in diminishing returns and just wasting money. And then I think the other one is just balance. Using I still see people using a lot of crystal malts, which I think throws the beer out of balance a little bit. I tend to max out the crystal malts at less than 10%. But certainly, early on, people were brewing with 15-20% crystal malt in their IPAs, and I think that's too much. So that still happens a bit, but just balance issues more than anything.
And just to clarify, when you say too many hops, you mean in volume, not in variety.
Not varieties, volume. And then just at some point you don't get anything out of those additional hops you keep throwing in there.
More negative than positive.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, you can get some of that grassy, stemmy, what I call stemmy character. Yeah.
Well, when everybody found out I was going to interview you, they said, you got to ask him, how do I get to do a collab with Mitch Steele? so I'm asking, okay?
So we at New Realm, we do 2 or 3 collaborations a year. We host 2 or 3.
Yeah.
So for us and for me personally, number one, I need to know the brewer. So I need to be on good terms, friends with the brewer.
He's got to be in your cell phone.
Yeah, well, maybe not that far, but I need to know who they are and what they're all about. I need to know that they make great beer, and I need to know that they run a good business. They're the kind of people we would like to work with. And from a core values standpoint, however you want to put it. If they're good people, good brewers, they run a good company that treats their people well, then I'm in, So,
well, I'm going to put you on the spot.
Okay.
You mentioned a beer that you really like, which was Celebration, and that's one of my favorites too. How about a great example of a West Coast IP that's commercial and is distributed widely? I'd love to know some that can you name some offhand that are widely distributed?
Oh, for sure. I still love Stone IPA.
Yeah.
I still love that beer, and I did not put that beer together. I did not create that beer. That was all Steve Wagner and the team before I got there. But I love that beer. Headhunter IPA from Heads
Oh, yeah.
is one of my absolute favorite IPAs of all time. I think Matt Cole is an amazing brewer. He's got a great team. They brew great IPA. Bell's Two Hearted,
Oh, that's
you know,
fabulous.
yeah. And then, in Georgia, we've got, I don't know if you'd call this a West Coast IPA, but Tropicalia from Creature Comforts is a wonderful beer. It's a little more tropical than a typical West Coast IPA, but it's a
But
wonderful
you'd
beer.
still count it as a West Coast IPA.
It's kind of the American IPA is where I'd put that one,
Okay.
but it's an absolutely wonderful beer.
I know that Bell's Two Hearted is pretty outstanding.
Yeah, that's a great.
That's a great beer. Well, how about what are your top tips for optimizing biotransformation?
Oh, biotransformation and doing like the getting that juicy character in a hazy IPA. I think number one, you've got to make the right yeast choice. So there are certain yeast strains that do this very well. Obviously the London Ale 3 is one of the premier strains for doing the biotransformation and doing hazy IPA. There's the Conan yeast from Vermont that's also well regarded for that. There's several others. I just as a brief side note, one of the things that I learned from a brewer out on the West Coast is that certain Kolsch yeasts do really great with biotransformation, which I was very surprised at. And we tried it, and it actually worked. And then hop choice, because certain hop varieties lend themselves to it, high geraniol contents, things like that. So the hop choice is really important as well.
Are there some favorites?
For me, yeah, we do a lot with El Dorado.
I like that.
Idaho 7 is really good at biotransforming. And I don't know if a lot of people use Idaho 7 in that aspect, because it's just a great hop on its own anyway. But we tried it one time and it was amazing how much orange character we got off the pilot batch that we did with that.
Is there a time limit that you have to where biotransformation starts to degrade into something that's transforming into something you don't like?
Um, No, I know there's a lot of research going on about that, about, when to add the hops, whether to add them, in the whirlpool and carry over everything, whether to add them after the fermentation starts, which is what we do. And then there are people that are having success adding them towards the end of the fermentation.
Yep.
So I think hop creep plays into that a little bit as well. So adding them earlier, you get that out of the way and you don't have to deal with that anymore. Uh, for us, our sweet spot is 24 hours. That's when we do our biotransformation hop edition. And, and that's worked well for us. So we haven't really done much work exploring other time frames.
Well, Mitch, when do you think the craft beer revolution began? I've been asking a lot of the people I've been interviewing, and I get a lot of different answers, but your perspective would be especially valuable.
Honestly, I would say the early to mid 1980s when people became aware of Sierra Nevada. The first brew pubs had started at that point. Um, that's and that's very personal for me because that's when I got into it. 1984, I took a trip up to Sierra Nevada with the class, the brewing class at Davis, and we did a field trip and went up there and visited and toured and that was it for me. I'm like, okay, this is it. This is cool. And so that's when it started for me. Now, I know some people probably say Anchor,
Yep.
and rightfully so, but I think once Sierra Nevada came onto the scene and people started realizing that hoppy beers could be really awesome, I think that's when most people started catching wind of it and getting excited about it.
That pattern is beginning to emerge. So you're not alone in that thought.
Awesome.
Well, Mitch, this is fantastic. Thank you for sharing your afternoon
Awesome.
with you. We have a beautiful brewery here.
Thank you.
I'm so glad you're here in Greenville. Welcome to Greenville.
Yeah, we're excited too. It's a beautiful town, beautiful city. Everybody's been so welcoming to us, and this is a iconic historic building that we're in. I just love it. It's
Great.
just wonderful.
Well, thank you so much.
All right,
And everybody else, thank you so much for joining us. Cheers.
cheers.
Okay. Well, I hope you enjoyed that. I hope you will add some comments in the chat and let me know about maybe your favorite West Coast IPA. I see Robert's got some travel planned. Henry saw you in there. Appreciate everybody that chatted, and I especially appreciate my Patreon supporters because they make these videos possible. So, everybody have a great Saturday and cheers.